Hi, this group consists of Addie, Ashley, Alex, and Tim, and we chose to focus on heat transfer applications in extreme survival conditions.
All right, hey everyone. I'm going to be focusing on and talking about heat transfer's role in surviving Arctic environments. The Arctic is actually one of the most extreme environments on Earth. Temperatures regularly drop below 0 degrees Celsius in the winter, and even summer rarely sees temperatures above freezing. And it's not just the cold that's dangerous, it's the wind, the lack of shelter, and the long periods of darkness during the polar nights. These all increase heat loss from the body. Wind chill can make the temperature feel much colder, dramatically accelerating convective heat loss. The Arctic is a desert by precipitation standards, anyways. It's cold, it's dry, it's vast, with very little vegetation or cover. So this limits the availability of natural resources for shelter or warmth. And because of polar tilt as well, the sun doesn't rise for weeks or months at a time in the winter. And that lack of sunlight eliminates solar radiation, which we use and rely on for some natural warming. Going to the next slide. So, starting with the basics, as we've learned through our thermal classes, we have conduction, convection, and radiation. Conduction in survival situations, but especially in the Arctic, all three, conduction, convection, and radiation, work against the human body, trying to pull heat away. Conduction happens when your body is in contact with cold surfaces like snow or ice in the Arctic. Convection occurs when cold air or wind strips away body heat. And radiation is the natural emission of heat from our body to the environment. And so, how we can combat this is with insulation. So, to counter conduction and convection, survival gear in the Arctic uses insulation. Insulated clothing traps air, a poor conductor, which slows down heat loss. Materials like goose down and synthetic fibers create tiny air pockets, preventing conductive and convective heat loss. Outer shells are windproof, stopping convective cooling from the Arctic wind. And for shelters, even shelter designs rely on heat transfer principles. So, for example, igloos are made of snow, not because snow is warm, of course, but because it's a great insulator. Despite being made from ice crystals, snow has trapped air inside it, reducing conduction. Inside an igloo, body heat and small fires raise the interior temperature to just below freezing, which is comfortable enough for survival. And we have some Arctic animal inspired tech. Uh, Engineers study animal adaptations like the fur of polar bears, which reflects infrared radiation back to the body. Some extreme cold weather closely mimics this by reflecting radiant heat back towards the body using metallic inner linings. And these reflective surfaces reduce radiative heat loss and improve warmth retention. So in the Arctic, survival is a constant battle against heat loss through conduction, convection, and radiation. Whether it's insulated gear, smart shelter design, or managing heat transfer is very crucial if you want to stay alive in the Arctic. And that's all I got to share today.
Hello, everybody. My name is Alex Van Acker, and today we're going to be talking about deserts. The reason that deserts are considered an extreme climate is due to the fact that there's a lot of exposure to wind and direct sunlight for most of the days in a year, with temperature ranges between 40 to 50 degrees Celsius and 5 degrees Celsius or lower. Although there have been some surface temperatures that have been recorded that have reached 70 degrees Celsius or above, mainly generally in the Middle East or places like Saudi Arabia or Yemen. Um, the methods of heat transfer in a desert include conduction, convection, and radiation. Examples of conduction in the desert um, are typically found through the desert soil or rocks absorbing heat from the sun, and then that heat being conducted through the surface and into the grounds. Examples of convection are when the surface of the desert heats the air in contact with it, which makes the hot air rise and cool air rush in to replace it, thus causing those high winds. And with radiation, the sun emits the electromagnetic waves that heat across vast desert areas, significantly increasing the temperatures. There are a couple systems that we can use to counteract these extreme conditions. Um, the first example being an evaporative cooling system. Evaporating cool system works by using the natural process of evaporation to cool the air. Water is evaporated, and as it changes from liquid to vapor, it absorbs all the heat from the surrounding air thus cooling the environments. The source of heat transfer that is considered here is through convection, um, mainly through the evaporation from that liquid to vapor phase, which lowers the air temperature overall. In desert climates, we can usually find this in the form of swamp coolers or wet cooling towers, as shown in the figure below. Another example that we see is solar desalination systems. These work by involving solar energy, which in turn is radiation, that heats water, evaporating it and leaving the salts behind. The vapor is then condensed to provide fresh water to many different areas. Heat transfer, again, in this example, is solar irradiation. In desert climates, we can see this in deserts because it's ideal to where fresh water is scarce. In places like Africa, we can use this to convert some salt water from the seas and convert it into fresh water for many different countries in the areas. Finally, another example that we can see this is through passive solar design. Places where you have extreme heats like Arizona or, again, the Middle East, you can see structures like adobe huts that are made with thicker walls to help absorb that heat a little bit quicker. In more modern areas like the US or more developed countries, you'll see more modern structures that will try to maximize the amount of shade possible to effectively cool the areas around it. And finally, another example of passive solar design is through insulated windows that will help deflect the electromagnetic radiation through the solar and emitting it back out into the environment.
So now focusing on space, there's no atmosphere, so there's no medium for convection or conduction to occur. There's also no traditional or atmospheric ways for heat dissipation available, like wind or other earthly factors. So heat transfer is only happening through radiation, typically from stars or suns or whatever's around. So there is extreme hot and cold. Sunlit areas can reach 250 degrees Fahrenheit. Shaded areas can drop to negative 250. A lot of people may think, oh, space is cold, but no, heat is the main issue because there is no way through convection or conduction to dissipate metabolic heat or radiated heat from space. There's no heating source in the unit. It completely relies on metabolic heat. So spacesuits are very complex for a good reason, but they use reflective materials to combat direct sunlight and that radiation. That's why they're typically white. They have multiple layers of insulation for thermal resistance. This combats both the hot and cold, typically focusing on the cold part here. For the hot part, they use an LCVG, which is a liquid cooling and ventilation garment. This uses conduction as an internal cooling system for metabolic heat and space radiation. It does so using a garment worn close to the skin. It's pretty skin tight, and it uses circulating water and a ventilation unit to maintain the correct body temperature. The water cooling loop picks up 60 to 80% of the astronaut's excess metabolic heat load, and the ventilation picks up 20 to 40%. The excess heat is released using a heat exchanger, and that is dissipated back into space as radiation. In this figure here, you can see the liquid cooling garment is worn very close to the skin. And then you can also see how it's white to reflect the heat, and then it's pretty thick, so there's quite a bit of insulation there.
In cold environments, conserving heat is critical for survival. Many Arctic animals have a thick layer of blubber under their skin, reducing thermal conductivity. This blubber serves as a thermal barrier that slows down conduction, the process where heat moves from the animal's warm body to a colder surface like ice or water. On top of that, dense fur or feathers trap a thin layer of air next to the skin. Since still air is also a poor conductor and prevents air circulation, it forms an insulating layer that significantly reduces convective heat loss. Behavioral adaptations help too. Penguins, for example, huddle in large groups to minimize the total surface area exposed to cold air. This reduces overall heat loss through both convection and radiation, allowing them to share warmth and conserve energy as a group. It's a really efficient survival method in sub-zero climates. In hot environments, animals face the opposite challenge because they need to get rid of excess internal heat to avoid overheating. Some desert animals, like the fennec fox, have large ears with dense networks of blood vessels. These ears serve as heat exchangers, allowing the body heat to be transferred through the surrounding air more easily through convection. Another effective adaptation is light-colored or reflective fur, which helps minimize radiative heat gain. For active cooling, many animals rely on evaporative cooling, which when animals pant or sweat, water absorbs heat from their body and then evaporates off the skin or from the respiratory tract. This phase change carries heat away from the body to maintain a safe body temperature. Animals use the behavioral adaptations to regulate their heat exchange with the environment. One common example is burrowing. The ground acts as a natural thermal buffer because of its relatively stable temperature due to thermal mass. Another behavioral strategy is being nocturnal, which is common in desert species. By being active at night, animals avoid the high solar radiation and ambient temperatures of the day, reducing the need for intense cooling mechanisms. Some animals take it a step further with seasonal migration. Birds and large mammals, for example, migrate long distances to stay within climates that match their ideal thermal range. This allows them to operate efficiently without needing extreme adaptations.